Assalamu alaikum, friends of Book Bites, darling readers. It's incredible to be back with our season 11 of Book Bites. And what a great time to get going with the wealth of new reads available as the weather has really been a test, alhamdulillah. But I've also had such a great boost having just come back from the Nairobi Literary Festival last weekend and knowing that there's an incredible amount of literature coming out of the African continent, but also locally, a whole wealth, like I said, of new material coming out. This evening, to start off season 11, I'm incredibly blessed and grateful to have the opportunity to speak with Professor Barbara Boswell. She's a writer and scholar from Cape Town, a city which inspires much of her fiction. She's an associate professor of English literary studies at UCT. Boswell is the author of Grace, a novel which I read a few years ago. I'm going to pick her brain a little bit about the background to that novel, which won the UJ Prize for debut creative writing. She wrote some nonfiction and wrote My Story Anyway, Black South African Women's Novels as Feminism in 2020. And Loretta Nkobo's Writing as the Practice of Freedom in 2022. The Comrade's Wife, which will be the main focus of today's discussion, is her latest novel. I had an incredible read of it, and I look forward to speaking to the author. Barbara, welcome to the show. It's really wonderful to have you on this inauguration of our season 11, and especially having just read The Comrade's Wife, which I enjoyed so much. Welcome to Book Bites.
Thank you so much, Shafinaaz. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now, before we get into, I have so many questions for you about The Comrade's Wife, but before we get into it, I want to speak about your journey as a writer. I read Grace a few years ago and I reread it recently after reading The Comrade's Wife. And I wanted to, kind of have that feeling of reading between the two novels. Speak to us about where your journey began and the story of Grace.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. Grace was my debut novel, and I came to writing quite late, or publishing at least. I think I published that I was 45 years old so that was my first piece of a published book. And, I wrote it while I was doing my PhD and while I was writing my dissertation in the University of Maryland in the USA. So I was busy working on this dissertation about Black women writers, and then at the same time, there's something about the dissertation really stirred my own creativity, and so that was somehow just the impetus for writing that novel came from there. And I've written about it also that the book is about gender-based violence, and I grew up in a home with gender-based violence, so part of it was really thinking through the issue of a child growing up and what happens to a child who lives in that environment and so on. So that was part of the impetus for writing that novel.
So when you look at and wrote My Story Anyway, so was that inspired by the thesis material that you were putting together at the time?
Yeah, so that book was based on my PhD dissertation. So after I finished my PhD, often one in the humanities, you can convert your dissertation into a book. And that's what I did with that book. I added a lot more chapters than originally existed in the dissertation.
And something like that would be a living document because you constantly would have more inspiration as new novels come out, as new material comes out. You could add to that sort of thing. How has that developed in your mind as the writer, as the originator of that document, as you've
Yeah,
seen so more coming out from your own
yeah,
writing and around you?
right. I started out with this project of documenting Black women's writing in South Africa in 2001. That's when I started my academic journey as a master's student at the University of the Western Cape. And since then, the whole field has burgeoned. I no longer consider myself really an expert in it because there was just a period post 2000 when Black women's publishing really, really took off and novels And we have a very, very large, now it's not that large, but still much larger than in the 1980s or even the 1990s, women writing. So in the field of poetry, you can just see the poetry scene has exploded for Black women. So the poets like Vuleka Putuma, Diana Ferris, Malika Ndlovu, Vangile Gancho, for example. There are too many to name. And similarly with novels and novelists, since about 2005, the field has just really expanded so exponentially, and it's very wonderful to see because there's just such a range of diverse voices. There are what I term in Black writing, there are bildungsromans, young women's stories, older women's stories, there are queer literatures, there are all the different types of literatures you could imagine all coming to the fore at the moment. It's quite exciting.
So, when I've read Grace and I've read The Comrade's Wife, and you write the theme of violence with so much of empathy and so much of gentleness. And someone might ask, well, what do you mean when you review a book and say violence has been written with gentleness? And I think that building those bridges of empathy, but also allowing a moment of reflection for those reading the book who might be able to identify with the material, really comes through in both of these novels. Um, Talk to us about writing violence, your literature.
So this is a conundrum that I grapple with. At UCT, I teach a master's course in the English department on race, gender, and representation. And we look at a lot of scholars' work who have, feminist scholars who have tackled this issue, like Desiree Lewis, Yvette Abrahams, Habiba Badaroun, who writes very beautifully about what it means to write about violence in a way where we are not perpetuating the violence. So I think for me, there's just been almost this, it's like a compulsion to write. The topics that I write about, they actually choose me. Sometimes I don't want to write about those particular topics, but there's something inside me that it feels very compelling to me to write about those issues. But the balancing act then is to how do I write it without making my reader feel traumatized. A lot of people have said after they read Grace, they felt triggered and traumatized. And so I've given a lot of thought to that. And I think what I try to do is really write in very I don't want to say poetic language because I don't think I succeed at that. But I want to write it as beautifully as possible as a way to almost soothe the reader or compensate for some of the really harsh topics that I cover. So I try to do that by balancing it. And then I also don't believe always in literal representation of acts of violence. I think there are many writerly techniques that one can use in order to infer violence without actually literally depicting it on the page. And I'm sure you know all of this and that you have also grappled with that. So in your own writing, um, I think about the Darlings of Durban, which I just so thoroughly enjoyed, and the hard topics that you also pick, and you represent them with a light, deft touch. And I think that is the challenge for those of us who are writing about the difficulties and violences that happen in our lives and in other people's lives.
And I found with Grace, I mean, I understand, that we do tend to stand in the shoes of our characters in order to authenticate them. But I find with Grace is you can really get a sense of the reflection that your character has through the experience and through the growth through the novel. But let's bring us now to The Comrade's Wife. So here you have this amazing opportunity that you've used to and you're very humble when you say you don't write poetically, because here's the poetry, right? The Comrade's Wife, straight on, you're taken into this journey of this academic, Anita Fredericks in this case, and she meets Neil and she's made this life of herself. um, I was really interested in how, like, when I talk about the personal being made political, but you bring the political into personal so strongly, and so beautifully. And it made me question a few things. For example, the choices we make as people, the personal choices we make, and how are they reflective in our lives, in this case, in the political life that Neil exists in and that Anita exists in. Speak to us about this sort of, I think, is it a conundrum or not, to navigate these spaces and to make these choices that might reflect on the outside.
Mm. Wow. So I think to write those things, the one, um, I have felt I really did want to make the personal political. So that was the aim. And I set out to do that. So it wasn't accidental. I wanted to take the politics of the country and the current politics, or maybe not the current politics, but politics of the last few years, and somehow condense and concentrate it into the relationship between a man and a woman. And I think about the marriage that is portrayed there as a kind of allegory for some of the political things we have been through in this country this last few years. And it wasn't really difficult for me because I had a clear sense of where I wanted to take the story, and I had a clear sense of how the issues that are political would also play out in the personal relationship. And I'm a feminist, and one of the tenets of the feminist movement that feminists say is the personal is the political. And it is so, even in Grace, the personal is the political. And in this novel, especially to have a politician as a character and look at how some of the strategies that a politician has to use in order to become powerful, ascend into power, maintain power, what it looks like when they bring that politics home, and how do they manage those kinds of tendencies and the things that they have to do in order to be successful. How do they use that in their personal relationships? So I that is what I was trying to show with this particular story, the characters and the relationship.
I mean, when we look at their romantic relationship, there's, one might say a latent power held by the man, and it's assumed in that way. And there's a point where, she's so sort of, I mean, I don't want to give away too much about the book, but she has to make a choice, and it almost seems like an easy choice to allow him to take control of their situation. Um, but she further gives away much of her power in doing so, just because
Mm-hmm.
she's in a corner in a way. And is it really taken for granted that women must um, give up this power in order to feel safer, in order to feel taken care of as such? And I guess to a degree she does contemplate what that means for her later on in life when she starts to regain that space for herself. Um, what can you say about that? I don't want to give
Ooh,
away your plot
yeah.
necessarily. I mean, just to sort of pick on some of those aspects that come through.
I did really want to look at how power operates in intimate relationships, and especially in heterosexual male female relationships. So it was taking almost like a magnifying glass to how power operates in that space of the intimate. Because again, as feminists, we know and we theorize how power relations work, and how ideologies of gender, of this is what it means to be a man, this is what it means to be a woman, this is what it means to be a good man, a provider, a caretaker of my wife, a steward, how those kinds of scripts that are created for us in society by various institutions, how they really make us as human beings, and what the outcomes can be. So in a heterosexual relationship, often I have heard um, in the culture that I come from, people saying, well, a wife should be submissive and a husband should lead and should be powerful and should be the head of the household. And what happens then if you're just at the mercy then if you're a woman, if you are co-opted into this and you buy into it. It's great when you marry a good man who is a good leader and a good steward, but what happens when people are human and they have character flaws, and what happens if this person abuses their power? So it really is a way for me to just think through some of these issues and look at this relationship as a kind of crucible for how power plays out, and then how she gives away her power, even knowing the ways in which power is taken from women. She still goes into it in that way and gives away the power, and then how she tries to reclaim it, and whether or not she's successful or not, that's for the reader to decide.
I was constantly questioning sort of, so if a person is successful in their field, whether in the field of politics or commerce or being in a corporate space or whatever, does it necessarily translate into being successful in a relationship? And I think
Hmm.
those same character flaws that you point out would operate in both spaces. And the thirst to be successful can sometimes make a person make poor business decisions, that might not constitute that might be very close to criminal activity for that matter, like scamsters operating to be successful, to make certain
Hmm.
amounts of money, and then that coming across into the household space where one might operate without conscience. So those are the kinds of questions I was asking of this situation. um,
Hmm.
as you said, I'll outline in a heteronormative stance, but also, human beings interacting in these spaces, there's an assumption of power on one hand that supersedes the other party.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, yeah, maybe a comment on that one starts to wonder: is this protagonist really a good person or a villain?
Well, it's not always that easy to say someone is a villain, and even good people have shadow sides and do bad things. And so-called villains, I don't know if anyone's really a villain. There are people who are trying to survive or trying to live a good life. I think everyone everyone boils it down, and maybe how they think they should get there is different. And what defines a good life? I think that's a huge question in this novel. What is enough? What is enough for a good life? And so I think to make what I've been told, especially about my male characters, in Grace there's Patrick and in this one there's Neil, is that I write them with a kind of a they're not always good people, but they're people like them, or not like them. Like is not the right word, but people really can identify with them, perhaps. Or some women have said of the Comrade's wife, they fall in love with this Neil character. So I also want to write complexity and not this is a good person and that is a bad person and they're in diametrical opposition to each other. But these are people who have problems, wounds, histories, traumas, and they act in certain ways, perhaps because of those histories and traumas.
And I think romantic relationships especially have opportunity to bring out, and perhaps heal those traumas because we triggered
Mm,
by those closest to us. And so I think you do that
definitely.
beautifully in the relationships. Yeah, you do that beautifully in the relationship between Anita and Neil, especially. And I found Patrick, I found empathy for Patrick in the novel Grace. I found I wanted to understand Patrick more. So there's definitely that opportunity to because this was something I attempted recently as well in my novel, and I found that real celebration of sisters looking out for you, friends looking out for you. Speak
Mm-hmm.
to us about the sisters, the friends.
Yeah, I so much enjoyed that in your novel, and you also have that complexity of characters who are good and doing unethical things, and what their motivations are. We have a bit of sympathy or empathy. So in my book, the friendship circle was so important because a lot of people, after they read Grace, I went to a lot of book club discussions, and they said, "Where was Grace's friends?" And so this time, and I thought, yeah, that's right. Grace doesn't have friends in Grace, a novel. And um, and this one, I wanted to really show the different kinds of love. There's the familial love, there's love of parents for their children, there's love for romantic love, a wife for a husband for a wife, boyfriends and girlfriends, and so on, romantic partners. And then there's this love of this um, women, of sisters, and not necessarily blood sisters, but friends who, and I think women especially, we find such support and succor and nourishment in our relationships with other women, which are non-romantic relationships if we're heterosexual, or so, those are the relationships that often sustain us and often outlast um, perhaps romantic relationships or marriages. And I wanted to also celebrate that and show how friendship can really pull people through difficult times and help them to survive and help them to see themselves properly in a situation when their own vision has been obscured and their own sense of self has been eroded.
Now that definitely comes through when there's that sense of support and camaraderie and real care. The feeling of being emotionally held by your friends and relying on their sense of judgment when yours is a little rose tinted, so to speak. But with Grace, I mean, while you're talking, I'm just remembering that, I remember in childhood having a friend who was very reclusive and came across as angry. And it only in adulthood realized that her isolation, and I think Grace has this isolation because of her circumstances, that isolation is maybe an sort of a feature of sometimes being within an abusive household, either the mistrust that just shows in isolation because you're so busy, you're so in survival mode. So I'm glad I went back to read Grace recently, once having read The Comrade's Wife, and I recommend that to more of your readers as they pick up the new novel as well. um where do you see further writing? Because I mean, this is building on such an amazing canon of work for you. Are you busy working with something new, and what do you see for The Comrade's Wife as it's being rolled out and engaged by book clubs and students and readers who've been loving it so far?
It's been quite amazing. One is always nervous when you publish a book and a new book because it's been a while since Grace. It was 2017. So it's a number of years. And then the responses that I've been getting have been phenomenal. People really like it or they hate it, and they feel either way, they feel passionate about it. And sadly, a lot of women are also saying, "Oh, we are familiar story. We all have a story like this." Um, so that's been very gratifying, and especially with social media now, I think I'm more plugged into social media, and I'm getting a lot of feedback on social media. So that's been really wonderful to see people just read the book and then post something on social media. And I'm collecting all of those snapshots. No one's posted anything bad yet, but hopefully, touch wood, they they won't. Um, so that's been exciting. But I, in the life of a book, I've finished this book more than a year ago, And so I'm working on a few different projects. I always work on different things simultaneously. So I'm working on an essay, I'm working on a short story collection, and I'm working on a novel, somewhat of a historical novel. And so those are the things that I'm doing right now. I haven't really worked, I'm a scholar also, and I need to start engaging in scholarship again, but I'm really enjoying working on fiction, and that's just where the heart is being pulled at the moment. So just go with where I'm most inspired and most excited to work. And I'm sure I will return to scholarship soon.
Well, we look forward to seeing what comes up. I think the thing with the comrade's wife is there's also a certain amount of potential scandal, wanting to see inside the life of a politician and maybe reading it, try and figure out, was this actually written about a politician of current, or is it just pure fiction? Whatever the
Yeah.
case, I recommend this book if anybody wanted to contemplate the inside life of a politician as well. But I mean, there's so many layers to this novel that I really enjoyed, especially your comment on academic life as well,
Mm,
and the choices that we make as women sometimes within these spaces. So
mm.
there were many aspects to contemplate from that, and we do wish you everything of the best with future writing, and especially thank you for the time that you've given us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you, Shafinaaz.
Well, like I said, all the best, and I hope that we'll be able to welcome you on the show again with further writing in the new year. And we look forward to seeing what you come up with. In the meanwhile, I'm highly recommending The Comrade's Wife, and I want everyone to be out there reading it, contemplating, writing back to you, and telling you what they think. So, once again, Barbara, thanks for being on the show with us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And so there you have it. We heard from Barbara Boswell, Cape Town author and academic, on her latest book, The Comrade's Wife. I highly recommend that you pick up copies of this book. It's a fascinating novel in so many ways. Read her previous work as well. And that's it from this evening's session of Book Bites. I hope you enjoyed our first taste of the season, and we'll have more coming up over the weeks to follow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.